Rio de Janeiro, a city synonymous with vibrant carnival, breathtaking landscapes and iconic landmarks. But beneath this dazzling surface lies a starkly different reality, a city fractured and contested. This isn't just about crime, it's about power. In 2022 alone, the state of Rio de Janeiro recorded nearly 3,000 lethal intentional violent crimes, a staggering number, much of it stemming from an ongoing brutal struggle for control waged by powerful armed groups. The sheer persistence and scale of this violence point towards something deeper than simple lawlessness. It suggests the entrenchment of parallel authorities operating with significant impunity, challenging the state itself. This conflict involves two primary types of actors, dominating vast territories and impacting the lives of millions. On one side, the long-established drug trafficking gangs, born from the crucible of prisons and favelas. On the other, a newer, rapidly expanding force, the militias, often formed from the very state agents meant to provide security. Understanding the crucial differences between these groups, their origins, their methods, their goals, is essential to grasping the complex dynamics shaping life, politics, and security in Brazil's most famous city. This is the story of how these shadow powers emerged, how they operate, and the devastating impact they have on the communities caught in their grip. We'll explore the distinct reigns of traffickers and militiamen, the shifting battle lines between them, and the state's often troubled, sometimes complicit response. Today, Rio de Janeiro is, honestly, a complex patchwork quilt of territories, controlled by these competing armed groups. Areas dominated by Comando Vermelho, Terceiro Comando Puro, or Amigos dos Amigos exist alongside, and increasingly in conflict with, territories controlled by various militia groups. The expansion of militias has been particularly aggressive in the city's vast west zone and parts of the Baixada Fluminense region, areas historically less dominated by the major drug factions. In fact, recent estimates suggest militias now control territory inhabited by more people than any single drug faction, signifying a major shift in Rio's power dynamics. The differences in their operations are, stark. Gangs remain primarily focused on the logistics and profits of the drug trade, leading to volatile conflicts over trafficking routes. Militias, conversely, focus on diversifying their income through the systematic extortion of basic services and local populations, embedding themselves deeply into the economic fabric of the communities they control, often under a veneer of forced order. Feature: drug gangs such as CV, TCP, ADA have their primary origins in prisons and community self-defense, while militias typically originate from state agents like police and firefighters. The primary business model for drug gangs is drug trafficking, whereas militias rely on extortion of services, illegal utilities, and real estate. Methods of control differ, with drug gangs using overt armed presence, social codes, and violence against rivals or the state, while militias use intimidation, control of necessities, targeted violence, and benefit from impunity via state links. The relationship with the state is also distinct. Drug gangs are primarily antagonistic, relying on corruption for impunity, while militias are composed of state agents, have political ties, and benefit from systemic complicity. In terms of territorial focus, drug gangs have historically controlled favelas, while militias are expanding across both favelas and formal neighborhoods, especially in the West Zone. This highlights the fundamental differences, but the reality on the ground also involves complex interactions, including temporary alliances, shifting rivalries, and intense conflict over territorial boundaries. Crucially, the expansion and resilience of both types of groups, especially militias, cannot be understood without acknowledging the role of state weakness and, in many cases, direct corruption and complicity. Evidence points to political entanglements, particularly concerning militias, where politicians may court militia support for votes, or militia leaders directly influence local politics, effectively blurring the lines between democratic governance and organized crime. This political infiltration provides cover, hinders investigations, and perpetuates the cycle of violence and impunity. The strength of these armed groups is therefore not merely a product of their own power, but is intrinsically linked to and often feeds off the failures and compromises within the state itself. They thrive precisely where the legitimate state is absent, weak, or corrupted. For the millions of ordinary citizens living under the dominion of either gangs or militias, life is, quite frankly, often a state of siege. The constant threat of violence permeates daily existence. Shootouts between rival factions or with police can erupt without warning, forcing residents to take cover, closing schools and businesses, and trapping people in their homes. Stray bullets claim innocent lives with tragic regularity. In militia-controlled areas, the violence might be less frequent and spectacular, but the oppression is constant and economic. Residents are forced to pay extortion fees for basic necessities: the cooking gas delivered to their door, the internet connection, the van ride to work. Prices are arbitrary and resistance is met with threats or worse. This constant drain of resources cripples already impoverished communities, making escape from poverty even harder. Both groups enforce their rule with brutality. Summary executions, disappearances, and dictates on social behavior are common. In militia areas, the fear is compounded by the knowledge that the perpetrators may well be state agents, leaving victims with little hope for recourse or justice. The psychological toll of living under such conditions, the constant fear, the lack of freedom, the feeling of abandonment by the state is immense and enduring. For these residents, the fundamental rights and protections associated with citizenship are often non-existent. They are subject not to the laws of Brazil, but to the arbitrary and violent dictates of the armed group controlling their street, their neighborhood, their lives. This reality fosters deep social and political alienation, eroding trust in institutions and challenging the very notion of a unified state. The Brazilian state has not stood entirely idle. Faced with escalating violence and territorial control by drug gangs, authorities launched a high-profile strategy in 2008, the Pacification Police Units, or UPPs. The stated goal was ambitious: to reclaim territories from traffickers, establish a permanent community policing presence, and pave the way for social services and state integration. Initially, some UPP-occupied areas saw significant drops in homicides and open gun battles, leading to cautious optimism. However, the program soon faced major challenges and criticisms. Reports of heavy-handed policing and human rights abuses by UPP officers damaged community relations. Critics argued the program focused too much on suppressing symptoms, that is, gangs, without addressing the root causes of violence, deep-seated poverty, lack of opportunity, and systemic inequality. Furthermore, the pacification effort often simply displaced violence to other areas, including the Baixada Fluminense and the city's peripheries. Crucially, the UPP strategy proved far less effective against the growing threat of militias. In some instances, the removal of dominant drug gangs by UPPs inadvertently created power vacuums that militias, with their state connections and different operating models, were quick to exploit. The very nature of militias, composed of state agents and often protected by political connections, makes them an extraordinarily difficult target for state action. Tackling militias effectively requires confronting corruption and criminality within the state's own security forces and political structures, a challenge fraught with institutional resistance and risk. This reveals a troubling paradox. State security interventions, even those intended to restore order, can falter or even have counterproductive outcomes in Rio's complex environment. Actions aimed at suppressing one form of armed group may inadvertently strengthen another, especially when the lines between the state and organized crime are so dangerously blurred. This suggests that purely tactical security approaches are insufficient without addressing the deeper institutional rot and political complicity that allow these groups to flourish. The story of Rio de Janeiro today is inseparable from the pervasive influence of its armed groups. Both drug gangs and militias exert profound control over vast territories and millions of lives, shaping the city's social, economic, and political landscape in distinct but equally damaging ways. Large swathes of the metropolitan region remain effectively outside of full state control. This is far more than a simple law enforcement problem. It is a complex crisis rooted in decades of social inequality, state neglect, endemic corruption, and deep political entanglements. The emergence and consolidation of militias, formed from state agents and operating through extortion and political influence, represent a particularly alarming evolution, blurring the lines between protector and predator, state and crime. Reclaiming Rio from the grip of these shadow powers demands far more than sporadic police operations or military interventions. It requires a sustained commitment to tackling systemic corruption within state institutions, particularly the security forces and political system. It necessitates genuine investment in marginalized communities, providing education, economic opportunities, and reliable public services to address the root causes of recruitment and disenfranchisement. And it demands a fundamental rethinking of security strategies, ones that acknowledge the unique challenge posed by militias and prioritize intelligence, internal affairs investigations, and political will alongside tactical operations. The fight for Rio's future, for the security and citizenship of its people, is complex, deeply entrenched, and far from over.